I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You know that feeling when the entire world just stops? When the air gets so thick you can barely breathe, and every second feels like an hour. That's what it was like in that courtroom. The air conditioning hummed like a trapped bee, but nobody heard it. All anyone could hear was the sound of their own heart, pounding in their ears, waiting for a single man in a black robe to pass a sentence that would shatter a family forever. And at the center of it all was Ben Carter. Just a few months ago, he was Detective Carter, a 22-year veteran of the Chicago PD, a man who commanded respect. Now, he sat slumped in a cheap wooden chair, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sickly and gray. He wasn't a cop anymore. To the jury, to the press, to the world, he was just a murderer. The man who killed his wife, Sarah. His eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, weren't on the judge. They were locked on his 17-year-old daughter, Chloe. She was sitting in the front row, just a few feet away, but she felt a million miles distant. She was so still. A statue of a girl, dressed in black, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't looked at him once. Not through the entire trial. And that silence from her hurt more than any guilty verdict ever could. The judge cleared his throat, and the whole room flinched. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paper in front of him. His voice was dry, official, like he was reading a weather report for someone else's town. The court has found the defendant, Benjamin Carter, guilty of murder in the first degree. The evidence presented was compelling and conclusive. The service weapon, registered to you, was the murder weapon. There was no sign of forced entry at your home. Your own colleagues testified to your recent, and I quote, unstable temperament. With every word, Ben seemed to shrink. Each piece of evidence was another brick being laid in the wall between him and the rest of his life. He was a man buried alive, listening to the dirt being shoveled on top of him. The judge paused and looked directly at Ben. Mr. Carter, before I pass sentence, this court affords you the opportunity to speak. Do you have anything to say? For a long moment, there was only silence. Ben's shoulders rose and fell with a shaky breath. And when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't the strong, confident baritone of a detective. It was a broken, ragged whisper, stripped raw. He didn't turn to the judge. He didn't address the court. He kept his eyes on that motionless girl. I didn't do this, sweetheart. The words were so quiet you had to strain to hear them, but in the dead silence of the room, they echoed. I loved your mother. I loved her. A single tear escaped Chloe's eye, tracing a path down her pale cheek. But she didn't wipe it away. She didn't move. She didn't look up. The judge sighed, a sound of mild inconvenience. The sentimental pleas of a guilty man. He picked up his gavel. By the power vested in me by the state of Illinois, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in the state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole until... And that's when it happened. Just as the gavel was about to fall, sealing Ben Carter's fate forever, a chair scraped against the polished floor. Chloe was standing up. If the sound of your own child's voice can send a chill down your spine, stay tuned. What she says next shocked the entire courtroom into silence. What happens next will change everything you think you know about this case. To understand how everything fell apart, you have to see what it looked like when it was still whole. Just a few hours before his life ended, Ben Carter was just a tired cop coming home. It was a typical Tuesday night. He pushed the front door open, his shoulders aching from a double shift. And the smell that hit him was home. Turpentine and oil paints. Sarah was in her studio, a converted sunroom at the back of the house, humming absently as she worked on a canvas. He didn't interrupt her, just watched for a second. She had a smudge of blue on her cheek. He remembered that so clearly. He found Chloe at the kitchen table, buried in a trigonometry textbook, frowning in that way she always did when she was concentrating. He'd ruffled her hair, and she'd swatted his hand away with a mock grumble, but she'd smiled. It was a perfect, normal, boring moment. The kind of moment you never think to be grateful for until it's gone forever. That normalcy shattered at 2:17 a.m. Ben was jolted awake by a sound. Not a gunshot. It was something else, a thud, maybe. Something heavy hitting the floor. His cop brain switched on before his dad brain did. He was out of bed, his heart already hammering against his ribs. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong. He pushed open the door to Sarah's studio. And the world stopped. She was on the floor. The beautiful, vibrant woman he'd kissed goodbye that morning was lying in a way no living person ever lies. And next to her, gleaming under the track lights, was his service weapon. His Glock 17. The one he kept locked in a safe upstairs. He didn't think. He just fell to his knees. Sarah? Sarah, no, baby, no. His hands went to her, trying to find a pulse, trying to wake her up, and her blood, still warm, coated his hands, his pajamas. He was a veteran detective, trained for horrific scenes, but this wasn't a crime scene. This was his wife. And in that moment, every bit of his training evaporated. All that was left was a raw, animal panic. He scrambled for the phone, fumbling, his bloody fingers slipping on the buttons. When the 911 operator answered, his voice was unrecognizable, a high, desperate plea. My wife, she's been shot. Please, send an ambulance. Please. He was begging. He was crying. He was a man whose entire world had just been executed in front of him. And as the first sirens wailed in the distance, his mind, finally catching up, whispered one terrifying, damning thought. My gun. It's my gun. And my fingerprints are the only ones on it. Imagine you're on that jury. You've seen the grieving daughter. You've heard the 911 call of a hysterical man. Now, the prosecution gets up, and they don't need to be flashy. They don't need to yell or scream. They just present the facts. And one by one, they build a wall around Ben Carter so high, so thick, that soon, you can't even see the man anymore. All you can see is a monster. It started with the gun. Of course, it started with the gun. The lead detective, a man Ben used to get coffee with, took the stand. He had to clear his throat, uncomfortable, but he did his job. He stated under oath that the bullet that killed Sarah Carter was a perfect ballistic match to Detective Benjamin Carter's department-issued sidearm. The murder weapon was his own gun. The prosecution let that hang in the air for a moment. His own gun. Then came the lack of forced entry. The front door was locked. The windows were locked. The back door was deadbolted from the inside. The prosecution painted a simple, terrifying picture. There was no boogeyman. There was no mysterious intruder. The only other person in that house with a key was the defendant. He was already inside. But a case needs a motive, right? They had one. A whopper. They called Ben's partner, Mike, to the stand. Mike looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He fidgeted. He avoided looking at Ben. The prosecutor asked him, gently, Detective, had Ben's behavior changed in the months leading up to his wife's death? Mike sighed. He was stressed. More volatile. We got into a shouting match in the precinct just a week before. It wasn't like him. The word volatile was now in the jury's mind. A volatile cop. Then, they presented the financial records. Ben and Sarah had been arguing about money. They had a second mortgage on the house. And then, the final nail, a life insurance policy on Sarah's life. A policy for $500,000, with Ben as the sole beneficiary. The prosecutor held up the document. Stressed about money, a volatile temper, and a $500,000 reason to make his wife's death look like something it wasn't. But the most damning piece of evidence, the one that probably sealed it for most of the jury, came from the Carters' next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. A sweet, elderly woman who bred Persian cats and always brought over cookies at Christmas. She took the stand, wringing her hands. The prosecutor asked her, Ms. Higgins, did you hear anything unusual on the night of the tragedy? She nodded, her eyes wide with regret. Oh, yes. Around 11 o'clock. I was letting my cat, Mittens, back in. And I heard them. Next door. Ben and Sarah. They were arguing. Could you hear what they were saying? The prosecutor pressed. No, not the words. But the tone. It was angry. He was shouting. I remember thinking, "Oh dear, I hope they're okay." She looked over at Ben, her face full of pity. "I just never thought. I should have called someone." He was shouting. In the gallery, Chloe flinched as if she'd been slapped. She remembered that night. She'd had her headphones on, listening to music to block out the world. But she remembered the tension at dinner. She remembered her mom being quiet, her dad being frustrated. And now, Mrs. Higgins's testimony confirmed it. Her parents had been fighting. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. The prosecution didn't need a complicated story. Their story was simple, and therefore believable. A stressed-out cop, in a bad marriage, drowning in debt, sees a way out. He stages a burglary with his own service weapon, but he's sloppy. He gets his wife's blood all over him in a panicked attempt to revive her, forgetting he's supposed to be the one who found her. He forgets to stage a broken window. He thinks his badge will protect him. It was the perfect case. And sitting in that courtroom, listening to it all, even Ben could see how perfect it was. He could see the truth, the real, terrifying truth, being buried under a mountain of coincidence and circumstance. And with every piece of evidence, he watched his daughter's face harden. He watched her believe it. And that was the real-life sentence, starting right there in that courtroom. While the lawyers built their castles of evidence in the courtroom, Chloe's world had shrunk to the size of a single painful question. How could the man who taught her to ride a bike be a monster? In the weeks after her mother's death, their home didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum of a life that had been stolen. And Chloe was the lone, silent curator. One afternoon, she decided she had to do it. She had to pack up her mother's art supplies. The sight of the empty easel was a fresh wound every morning. The studio still smelled like her, a mix of linseed oil and her favorite jasmine perfume. Chloe's hands trembled as she picked up a paintbrush. There was still a dab of crimson paint dried on the handle. For a wild, horrible second, her mind flashed to blood, and she dropped the brush like it was on fire. She slid down against the wall, hugging her knees, surrounded by the ghost of her mother's creativity. The silence in the room was deafening. It was in that silence that the prosecution's story felt the most true. Her father's voice, shouting. The gunshot. The story fit perfectly into the quiet. But then, a memory surfaced. A conversation she'd overheard a week before her mom died. Not a shouting match. It was late, and her parents were in the kitchen. She'd come down for a glass of water. Her dad's voice was low, worried. "We'll figure it out, Sarah. I promise. I'll pick up more shifts." Her mom had replied, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with anger. "It's not just the money, Ben. I'm scared." What had she been scared of? At the time, Chloe had assumed it was bills. Now, the question echoed in the empty studio. Scared of what? The world outside was no better. School was a special kind of torture. The hallway whispers stopped when she walked by. Her friends didn't know what to say, so they said nothing at all. She was the cop killer's daughter. She ate lunch alone in a bathroom stall. The lock clicked firmly into place, trying to block out the world that had already decided her father was guilty. One night, rummaging through an old box for a photo of her mom, she found a birthday card. It was from her 13th birthday. On the front, it had a cartoon dog wearing a party hat. Inside, in her father's messy, all-caps handwriting, it read, "To my brave girl. No matter how old you get, you'll always be my hero. Love, Dad." My brave girl. The words felt like a lie now. A script from a character her father had been playing. She threw the card back in the box, the warmth of the memory curdling into something bitter. This was the man who wrote sweet cards. This was also the man the entire justice system said murdered her mother. She had to believe the evidence. She had to. To believe otherwise was to admit that the world was so much more random and terrifying than she could handle. But as she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Mrs. Higgins's testimony about the shouting match replayed in her mind. And against her will, another sound followed it. The sound her father had mentioned in his jailhouse visit. The one she dismissed as the rambling of a guilty man. The humming. Her mother always hummed when she was nervous or scared. A soft, tuneless hum. A lullaby she'd made up when Chloe was a baby. And as Chloe finally drifted into a fitful sleep, a treacherous, tiny thought took root in the dark soil of her grief. What if he wasn't lying? Now, you might be thinking, what about the other side? What about Ben's lawyer? Surely he had a trick up his sleeve, a surprise witness, a piece of evidence that would blow the case wide open. The truth was, Ben's defense attorney, a man named David Miller, was playing a game of chess with only half his pieces. And every move he made, the prosecution had already anticipated. His first and weakest move was to talk about Ben's character. He called fellow officers to the stand. "Tell us about Ben Carter," he'd say, full of hope. "What kind of cop was he?" And they'd say all the right things. A good cop. A stand-up guy. "He saved my partner once." But under cross-examination, the prosecution would gently ask, "And in the last 6 months, did you notice a change?" And every single one of them, with a pained look, had to admit, yes. He was on edge. Stressed. So the character witnesses didn't build Ben up. They just reinforced the prosecution's idea of a man cracking under pressure. Next, David tried to introduce the idea of an intruder. Isn't it possible, he'd argue, that someone else, someone Ben had put away, did this to frame him? It was a good theory. But it was just that, a theory. It had no legs. The prosecution would simply stand up and say, "Where is the evidence of this mastermind? No forced entry. No DNA that doesn't belong to the family. No mysterious fingerprints. Your Honor, this is pure speculation." And the judge would agree. The idea was shot down, over and over. It started to sound desperate, like a wild story you'd tell when you had nothing else. The biggest problem, the one that hung over the entire defense like a dark cloud, was Ben himself. He was broken. The fire, the spirit of the detective he once was completely gone. He just sat there, hollowed out, a shell of a man. The jury saw that. They didn't see an innocent man fighting for his life. They saw a guilty man crushed by the weight of what he'd done. David Miller knew this was a disaster. In a private meeting, he'd pleaded with Ben. "Ben, you have to take the stand. You have to look the jury in the eye and tell them you didn't do it. This is our only shot." But Ben just shook his head, his eyes vacant. "And what do I say, David? They'll tear me apart. They'll ask me why I touched the gun. They'll ask me why there was no break-in. They'll make me talk about the insurance money. They have an answer for everything I say. My words, they're just more evidence against me now." He was right. From a legal strategy, it was the correct, if painful, choice. Ben staying silent was his only shield. But to the jury, and most importantly, to Chloe, it was the ultimate confession. Chloe watched this all unfold from her front row seat. She saw the weak character references. She saw the desperate intruder theory get shredded. And she saw her father refuse to speak in his own defense. Each day was another layer of cement settling around her heart. The defense wasn't proving his innocence. They were just proving how guilty he looked. By the time David Miller gave his closing argument, his voice had a defeated tremor. He talked about reasonable doubt. He begged the jury not to convict on circumstance. But his words felt small and hollow against the mountain of facts the prosecution had built. As he sat down, he glanced at Ben, then at Chloe. He saw the resigned look on Ben's face. He saw the hardened, betrayed look on Chloe's. And in that moment, he knew. He hadn't just lost a case. He'd watched a family be utterly destroyed, and he had been powerless to stop it. The defense's hand wasn't just weak, it had been folded from the very start. The night before the sentencing, Chloe found herself standing outside the county jail. It was a concrete block of a building, gray and soulless, smelling of stale coffee and industrial bleach. She hadn't planned on coming. But something, a stubborn final ember of the love she'd once had dragged her there. The visiting room was everything you'd imagine. A plastic chair bolted to the floor, a scratched plexiglass window, and a telephone receiver that felt cold and heavy in her hand. When Ben was led in, flanked by a guard, he looked worse than he had in court. The circles under his eyes were like bruises. But when he saw her, a flicker of light, fragile as a candle flame, sparked in his eyes. He fumbled for his receiver. "Chloe." His voice was a cracked whisper through the static. "You came." She didn't smile. She couldn't. "They sentence you tomorrow," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Chloe, listen to me. You have to believe me. I didn't do this. There was someone else in the house that night. I know it." It was the same plea. The one she'd heard 100 times. And for the first time, she let her anger break through the icy silence. "Stop it," she hissed, her hand tightening on the phone. "Just stop. The evidence doesn't lie, Dad. Only you do. Your gun. No break-in. The insurance money. Everyone knows what you did." The flame in his eyes guttered and died. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had held hers so tight when she was little. He seemed to shrink, to collapse in on himself. The last of his fight was gone. "Then I've lost everything," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I've lost Sarah. I've lost you. I've lost my life. There's nothing left." The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut. This was it. This was goodbye. The anger in Chloe cooled, leaving behind a vast, empty sadness. This broken man was her father. And tomorrow, he would be gone forever. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers through the grimy glass. They were filled with the tears he was too proud to shed. "I loved your mother," he said, his voice thick. "I loved her more than my own life. You have to know that." He started to stand, his movements slow and defeated, like an old man. The guard stepped forward. It was over. But then Ben paused. He leaned back toward the glass, his forehead almost touching it, as if he could get just a little closer to her. He spoke again, his words so quiet she barely heard them, but so bizarre they cut through her grief. "The humming Chloe," he whispered, his eyes desperate, pleading for her to understand. "Your mother was humming before I found her. She was humming that little song. The one she always hummed when she was scared." And then the guard led him away. He disappeared through a heavy metal door without looking back. Chloe sat there, the cold phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Humming. The word echoed in the empty space he left behind. It was such a strange, specific, and utterly useless thing to say. A lie a guilty man would concoct? Or a detail so true and so ingrained that it was the last thing his broken mind could cling to? She walked out of the jail into the cold night air. The image of her father's shattered face burned into her mind. But underneath the grief and the anger, a new, tiny seed had been planted. A seed of doubt. Because he was right. Her mother did hum when she was scared. A soft, tuneless version of, "Hush, little baby." It was her tell. A secret between the three of them. And as Chloe replayed the frantic, horrific moments of that night in her head, a memory fought its way to the surface. A memory from right before the gunshot. Lying in bed with her headphones on, the music barely drowning out the world, and the faint, faint sound of her mother's humming, drifting down the hall from her studio. The prosecution said it was a fight. A violent argument. But her mother hadn't been shouting. She'd been humming. She'd been scared. Back in the courtroom, the air was thick with finality. It was over. The judge had spoken the words that would define the rest of Ben Carter's life, 25 years to life. Ben felt the sentence hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped. He was a boat cut loose, drifting into a dark, endless ocean. He forced himself to take one last look at his daughter. Remember her face. This would be the image he'd carry into the darkness. Her head bowed, her profile sharp with pain. He wanted to say goodbye, but the word was a stone in his throat. The judge picked up his gavel. That small, wooden hammer was the instrument that would make it all official. It would seal the court record and slam the door on Ben's freedom. The sound it was about to make would be the period at the end of the worst sentence ever written. Thud. The sound echoed through the silent room. But it wasn't the gavel. It was the sound of a chair leg scraping violently against the polished wooden floor. Every single head in the courtroom swiveled. Reporters stopped scribbling. The jury, their duty done, stared in confusion. The bailiff, who had been standing relaxed, suddenly straightened up, his hand going to his hip. Chloe was on her feet. Her heart wasn't just pounding. It was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She could feel the blood roaring in her ears. Her palms were slick with sweat. The entire room was a blur, but the path between her and the judge was crystal clear. "Your Honor." The words came out as a choked gasp, too quiet. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into her voice. "Your Honor." Judge Wilkins froze, his gavel hovering in midair. His brow furrowed in profound annoyance. "Young lady, you will sit down. This proceeding is concluded." The prosecutor was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this is a highly inappropriate. I have evidence." Chloe's voice cut through his, louder this time, sharp and clear. She clutched the worn leather sketchbook to her chest like a shield. "My father is innocent. I can prove it." A wave of sound, gasps, murmurs, shifting bodies, erupted in the room. A deputy took a step toward her, but the judge held up a hand. His eyes narrowed. He was a man of procedure, of order. But he was also a man deeply familiar with the theater of the courtroom, and this was a scene he had not anticipated. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you have had weeks to come forward with any evidence. You sat through this entire trial." "I didn't understand what it meant until now," Chloe pleaded, her voice trembling but unwavering. She looked from the judge to her father. Ben was staring at her, his face a mask of utter shock and dawning, impossible hope. It was that look, the raw, desperate hope in his eyes, that solidified her resolve. "Your Honor, please," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's what my mother saw. It's all in here." The judge studied her for a long, agonizing moment. The entire courtroom held its breath. He glanced at the furious prosecutor, then back at the pale, determined girl standing in the gallery. He slowly lowered his gavel. "Approach the bench," he commanded. "And this had better be substantial." What evidence could a grieving teenager possibly have that an entire police investigation missed? A sketchbook? A drawing? What could be in there that changes a murder conviction? I want you to think about it. What would you have done if you were the judge in that moment? Comment your guess below, because the truth is more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The walk from the gallery to the front of the courtroom was the longest walk of Chloe's life. Every eye was a laser burning into her skin. The judge's impatient stare, the prosecutor's furious glare, the reporters leaning forward like vultures scenting a new story. But she kept her eyes locked on her father. The confusion and hope in his face was her only anchor. She stopped before the judge's bench, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the sketchbook. The bailiff stepped forward to take it, but she clutched it tighter for a second. This was her mother's voice. This was all she had left. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking. "This is my mother's sketchbook. She was an artist. But she was also a noticer. When something worried her, she didn't always talk about it. She'd draw it." The prosecutor threw his hands up. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A sketchbook? This is not evidence. It's the doodles of a—" "Let her continue, counsel," the judge interrupted, his curiosity now genuinely piqued. He nodded for Chloe to go on. Chloe took a deep breath and opened the book. She turned it around to show the judge, and then the prosecutor, the first of many pages. "For the last 3 months before she died, my mother was drawing the same man. The first few sketches were rough. A man in a dark beanie, sitting in a generic sedan across the street. A figure with broad shoulders, seen from behind, near their mailbox." The prosecutor scoffed. "A man in a car? This is your evidence. It could be anyone." But Chloe kept turning the pages. "Look closer," she insisted, her voice growing stronger. Look at the details, she kept adding. The sketches became more refined, more focused. The man was always there, lingering in the background of their lives like a shadow. And then, Chloe turned to a page that made the prosecutor's smug expression falter. It was a close-up, drawn with such precise, anxious lines it was almost a photograph. The man's face. He had a strong jaw, a broken nose that had healed crookedly, and close-cropped dark hair. But the most striking feature, the one her mother had drawn with obsessive detail, was a scar. A thick, pale, ropus scar that started just below his left ear and sliced down his neck, disappearing into the collar of his jacket. She saw him everywhere, Chloe explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. At the grocery store. In the park. Outside my school. She was trying to document him. To prove she wasn't crazy. She turned another page. And then another. Each sketch was a log entry of her mother's growing fear. The man at the gas station. The man in the rain, watching the house. The dates, scrawled in the corner, showed a pattern of stalking that spanned weeks. Then, Chloe turned to the final drawing. The air left the room. It was a frantic, almost chaotic sketch, the lines hurried and deep, smudged in places as if drawn in a panic. It was the view from her mother's studio window, looking out into their backyard. And pressed against the glass, his face distorted by the pain but unmistakable, was the same man. The scar was clearly visible. His eyes were dark, intense, and locked directly on the artist. Scrawled in the margin, in her mother's handwriting, were the words, "He's here. He's watching me. 9:47 p.m." The date etched below was the date of her murder. For a long moment, no one spoke. The prosecutor was silent, staring at the drawing of the scarred man. The judge adjusted his glasses, leaning in for a closer look. The perfect, simple story of a husband killing his wife suddenly had a third character. A man with a scar, lurking in the shadows, watching Sarah Carter in the hours before she died. Chloe looked over at her father. Ben's face was ashen, his eyes wide with a horrible, vindicated understanding. He hadn't been paranoid. Sarah had been scared. And she had died trying to prove it. The sketchbook wasn't just a collection of drawings. It was a diary of fear. And it had just blown a hole right through the heart of the prosecution's case. The sketchbook had introduced a ghost, a man with a scar. But a ghost isn't enough to overturn a murder conviction. The prosecution could still argue it was a stranger, a random stalker, unrelated to the crime. Chloe knew she had to connect the two. And she had the key. The strangest, most personal key imaginable. As the courtroom buzzed over the sketches, Chloe looked directly at the judge. "There's more, Your Honor." She then turned to face the prosecutor, her voice clear and certain. "You said my father's story was a lie, that he made up an intruder. But he told me one specific thing that night in jail that only someone who was there would know." The prosecutor crossed his arms, a skeptical scowl on his face. "And what profound clue was that, Miss Carter?" "He told me that right before he found her, my mother was humming." A few people in the gallery stifled laughs. The prosecutor's scowl deepened into a look of pure contempt. "Humming? Your Honor, this is beyond frivolous. This is a desperate—" "She only ever hummed one thing," Chloe continued, her voice rising above his, fueled by a sudden, fierce love for her mother. "When she was scared, or nervous, or worried about me, she'd hum this soft, tuneless little version of 'Hush, Little Baby.' It was our thing. It was the sound of my childhood. The sound of her." She looked over at her father. Ben had his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking silently. He wasn't crying from sadness now, but from a devastating wave of recognition. He had been telling the truth, and his daughter, finally, was listening. Chloe turned back to the court, her eyes glistening. "The night she died, I was in my room with my headphones on. But right before the gunshot." Her voice broke, but she pushed through. "I heard it, faintly, through the music. I heard her humming that same song." The implication hung in the air, clear and undeniable. The prosecution's entire case was built on a violent, heated argument. A shouting match. But Sarah Carter wasn't shouting. In the minutes before her death, she wasn't enraged. She was terrified. She was doing the thing she always did when she was scared, a quiet, private signal of her fear. She was humming a lullaby. The humming proved Ben was telling the truth. He had heard her before he entered the room. It corroborated his story at its most specific, most bizarre detail. It painted a completely different picture of those final moments. Not a husband and wife screaming at each other, but a terrified woman, aware of a threat, humming for comfort as a monster watched her through the window, and a husband rushing to her side, only to find the horror that awaited him. In that moment, the perfect case didn't just have a crack. It had a heartbeat. And it was the sound of a mother, humming in the dark. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom for about 3 seconds. And then, all hell broke loose. It was like a dam bursting. The gallery erupted into a roar of frantic whispers and exclamations. Reporters scrambled for their phones, their fingers flying as they typed out the most shocking legal turnaround of the year. The judge slammed his gavel down, over and over. Order. I will have order in this court. But there was no order. There was only chaos. Ben Carter was still standing, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He was staring at Chloe as if she were a miracle. The crushing weight of despair on his shoulders was cracking, replaced by a dizzying, terrifying sensation he hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was so raw and so powerful it made him lightheaded. The prosecutor was a thundercloud. He was on his feet, his face flushed with anger. Your Honor, I object. This is highly prejudicial. These drawings and a story about humming do not outweigh a mountain of physical evidence. This is a travesty. But the judge, Judge Wilkins, was a shrewd man. He looked from the furious prosecutor, to the shell-shocked jury, to the defiant, trembling girl, and finally to the man who now looked less like a convicted murderer and more like a victim of a terrible, terrible mistake. He knew. He knew in his bones that the trial was now tainted. You can't unring a bell. You can't ask a jury to forget the image of a scarred man staring through a window on the night of the murder. You can't erase the haunting detail of a lullaby hummed in fear. With a heavy, world-weary sigh, he raised his hand for silence. The room slowly quieted, every person hanging on his next words. The court cannot, in good conscience, proceed with sentencing, he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. The presentation of new, potentially exculpatory evidence which directly corroborates the defendant's original statement, creates a fundamental flaw in these proceedings. He looked directly at Ben. Mr. Carter, the guilty verdict is vacated. A mistrial is declared. The words were legal, dry, but their effect was explosive. Ben let out a choked sob, his legs finally giving way as he collapsed back into his chair. He wasn't free. He was still accused. But he wasn't condemned. The door to his cage, which had just been slammed shut, was now cracked open. Chloe felt a wave of relief so intense it made her knees buckle. She reached out and steadied herself on the wooden bench in front of her. But as the bailiffs moved to lead a dazed Ben away, the judge's stern voice cut through the celebration. This is not an acquittal. The state may choose to retry this case, with this new evidence included. He looked at the prosecutor, whose expression was pure steel. We are not at the end of this road. We are, perhaps, just at a very different beginning. Ben was led away, but this time his eyes met Chloe's. And in that look was a new, unspoken message. It was no longer just, I'm innocent. It was, I believe you now. And he's still out there. With the mistrial declared, the case against Ben Carter was no longer a solid wall. It was a crime scene itself, and now, new detectives were being called in to dust it for fingerprints. The problem was, the crime scene was 6 months cold. The case was handed over to Internal Affairs, and the lead investigator was a woman named Detective Ana Reyes. She was sharp, skeptical, and hated headlines. She walked into the evidence room, looked at the box labeled Carter, and sighed. She had seen co-workers go down for corruption. The idea of one going down for murder didn't surprise her. But her job wasn't about what she believed. It was about what she could prove. Her first order of business was the sketchbook. She laid the pages out on a large light table, the image of the scarred man staring up at her. "All right, buddy," she muttered. "Let's see who you are." She started with the most basic tool, the department's facial recognition software. She uploaded a high-resolution scan of the most detailed sketch, the one of the man at the window. The system whirred, comparing the artist's lines to thousands of booking photos. It was a long shot. The drawing was good, but it was still a drawing. 5 minutes later, the computer chimed. A match. 92% probability. The name on the screen was Marcus Thorne. Detective Reyes leaned in, her skepticism evaporating in a heartbeat. She pulled his file. Marcus Thorne. A known enforcer for a mid-level drug syndicate that operated on the South Side. His sheet was a rap sheet of violence. Assault, armed robbery, intimidation. And there, in his booking photo from a 3-year-old arrest, was the scar. A pale, ropa line slicing down his neck, just as Sarah Carter had drawn it. The ghost had a name. Now, Reyes had a direction. She cross-referenced Marcus Thorne with Ben Carter's old cases. It didn't take long. 2 years ago, Ben was the lead detective on a major drug bust that sent 3 of Thorne's associates to prison for a long, long time. The case had crippled the syndicate's operations. Thorne had narrowly avoided arrest, but his livelihood had been destroyed. The motive was suddenly crystal clear. This wasn't a random burglary. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a hit. A message. You put my friends away, I take away what you love most. And by making it look like Ben did it, that was the masterstroke. It wasn't just revenge, it was utter annihilation. Reyes then did what the original investigation, in its rush to convict the husband, had failed to do thoroughly. She pulled all the traffic and security camera footage from a 1-mile radius around the Carter house on the night of the murder. 4 hours, her team scanned grainy footage from gas stations, stoplights, and storefronts. And then, they found it. At 9:38 p.m., just 9 minutes after the time scrawled on Sarah's final drawing, a dark-colored sedan was caught by a red light camera 2 blocks from Hemlock Street. The driver's side window was down. And clear as day, you could see the profile of the man behind the wheel. The strong jaw, the crooked nose. Marcus Thorne. The original detectives had seen a car. They'd logged it as unrelated traffic. They'd had their killer. Why look for another? Detective Reyes picked up the phone, her mouth a grim line. She had to call the district attorney. And then, she had to call Ben Carter. The man they'd all written off as a murderer was, almost certainly, the victim. And the real killer was still out there, a ghost who had just been dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. Ben was out on bail, but he wasn't free. He and Chloe were moved to a safe house, a small, beige, anonymous apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was furnished with the ghosts of other people's lives, and it smelled like stale air and fear. They knew it was only a temporary solution. Marcus Thorne was a professional. He'd been hired to send a message, and he'd failed. Ben was out of prison. The message had been erased. The syndicate that hired him wouldn't be happy. And Thorne. He had a reputation to uphold. He had loose ends to tie up. Sitting at a rickety kitchen table, Ben looked at his daughter. The relief of the mistrial had been replaced by a new, more immediate terror. "He's going to come for us, Chloe. He can't let this stand." Chloe nodded, her face pale but her eyes clear. She wasn't the silent, grieving girl from the trial anymore. She was a young woman who had stared down a courtroom and won. "I know." Detective Reyes had a plan. Keep them hidden, round-the-clock surveillance. Wait for Thorne to make a mistake. It was a good, safe, police plan. But Ben was done with safe. He was a cop again, his instincts roaring back to life. "Waiting is what he expects," he said, his voice low and steady. "He'll be careful. He'll take his time. He might wait for months. We'll be looking over our shoulders forever." He leaned forward. "We can't wait for him. We have to make him come to us. On our terms." Reyes was vehemently against it. "It's too risky, Ben. You're using yourselves as bait." "But we're the only bait he'll bite," Chloe said, surprising them both. She looked from the detective to her father. "He knows me. He knows I'm the one who identified him. My mother's sketches. I'm the witness. He'll come for me to finish the job." The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would leak a story to a trusted reporter. The story would say that Chloe Carter, traumatized by the ordeal, was beginning to recover more detailed memories of the night her mother died. That she was working with a forensic artist and was close to remembering a crucial detail about the intruder. Maybe a tattoo, maybe a specific word he'd muttered. It was a lie, but it was a believable one. The story ran on the evening news. Ben and Chloe sat in the safe house living room, watching it. The reporter stood outside the courthouse, talking about the brave daughter and her breakthrough memories. It felt like they had just shouted their location into a storm. The surveillance team was in place, hidden in a van down the street and in the apartment across the hall. The air in the safe house was electric with tension. Every car that drove by too slowly made Ben's hand twitch. Every creak of the old building made Chloe's heart jump. They were sitting ducks. But they were armed, prepared ducks. Ben had a clarity he hadn't felt in years. This was no longer about defending himself in a courtroom. This was about protecting his daughter. This was a fight he understood. As night fell, casting long shadows across the cheap carpet, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Ben checked the lock on the door for the 10th time. Chloe watched the street from a slit in the blinds. The trap was set. All they could do now was wait in the terrible, silent darkness, and hope they weren't the ones about to be caught. The waiting is always the worst part. Your mind plays tricks on you. Every floorboard creak is a footstep. Every hum of the refrigerator is a whispered threat. Ben and Chloe sat in the dark of the safe house living room, not speaking, just listening. The police radio on the table, connected to the surveillance team, was silent. Too silent. And then, it happened. Not at the door. Not at a window. A faint, almost delicate scraping sound came from the ceiling. From the attic. Ben's head snapped up. That was wrong. All the entry points were covered, but the attic access was a simple panel in the hallway ceiling. They'd checked it, but it was flimsy. A professional would know that. A professional would come from the one place no one ever looks. He met Chloe's wide, terrified eyes and put a finger to his lips. He pointed to the hallway, then mimed someone coming down. Her hand flew to her mouth. The scraping became a soft thud. Then, the sound of the attic panel being slowly, carefully pushed aside. He was inside. Ben's mind went cold and clear. This was it. He gestured for Chloe to get behind the couch. He moved silently to the edge of the hallway, pressing his back against the wall, his body tensed. He was unarmed. The police had his back, but they were outside. They were seconds away, but seconds felt like hours. A figure dropped into the hallway with a soft, cat-like grace. He was bigger than Ben had imagined, a hulking shadow in the dark. He turned, and a sliver of moonlight from a window fell across his face. The scar. It was him. Marcus Thorne. He didn't head for the master bedroom. He turned directly toward the living room. Toward Chloe. Ben launched himself forward, not with a shout, but with a guttural roar. He slammed into Thorne, driving him back against the wall. It was like hitting a brick wall. Thorne grunted, surprised for only a second before his training kicked in. He drove an elbow into Ben's side, a sharp, blinding pain that stole his breath. "The famous cop," Thorne hissed, his voice a low gravel. "Should have stayed in prison. Would have been cleaner." He shoved Ben off and took a step toward the living room. Ben scrambled, grabbing his leg, trying to drag him down. "Chloe, run!" he yelled. But Chloe didn't run. She stood up from behind the couch, a fire in her eyes he'd never seen before. "You killed my mother," she said, her voice shaking but loud. Thorne stopped, a cruel smile twisting his features. "She was in the wrong place. Saw my face one too many times. Your dad here, He put my friends away. This was just business. You framed him, Chloe shot back, her voice gaining strength. You used his gun. Easiest job I ever had, Thorne sneered, taking a step closer to her, ignoring Ben who was still clinging to his leg. Cops are so predictable. They see what they want to see. That's when Ben saw it. The glint of metal in Thorne's hand. A knife. With a final surge of strength, Ben yanked Thorne's leg hard, throwing him off balance. Thorne stumbled, and Ben was on him, his hands going for the wrist holding the knife. They crashed into a side table, sending a lamp shattering to the floor. It was a brutal, ugly struggle. Ben was fighting with a father's rage, but Thorne was fighting with a killer's efficiency. He was younger, stronger. He punched Ben in the jaw, a crack that echoed in the small space. Ben's grip on the knife hand loosened. Thorne raised the knife. No. It was Chloe. She didn't scream it. She roared it. She threw the heavy, ceramic base of the broken lamp. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it smashed into Thorne's shoulder, distracting him for a split second. It was all Ben needed. He headbutted Thorne, a sickening crunch as his forehead connected with the killer's nose. Thorne howled in pain and surprise, his grip on the knife faltering. Ben seized his wrist and slammed it again and again into the floor until the knife skittered away. Then the door exploded inwards. Police swarmed the room, red and blue lights flashing through the windows, shouting, "Get down! Get down on the ground!" It was over. Ben collapsed off of Thorne, his body screaming in pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked over at Chloe, who was standing frozen, tears now streaming down her face. The bravery had left her, replaced by the shock of what had just happened. The police hauled a bleeding, cursing Marcus Thorne to his feet. Thorne looked at Ben, blood pouring from his broken nose, and smirked. "You got me, cop. But you still don't know who paid the bill, do you?" He was right. They had the weapon. But they still didn't have the hand that pulled the trigger. In the blinding, chaotic aftermath of the fight, with police swarming the small apartment and Marcus Thorne being hauled away in handcuffs, one sound cut through the noise for Ben Carter. It wasn't the squawk of the radios or Thorne's fading curses. It was a single, soft word. "Dad." He turned. Chloe was standing there, shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. The fierce bravery was gone, replaced by the vulnerable girl he remembered. In 2 strides, he was across the room, and she fell into his arms. He held her tightly, his own body trembling with adrenaline and a relief so deep it felt like a physical pain. He buried his face in her hair, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he let the tears fall. They weren't tears of despair. They were tears of a long, terrible drought finally breaking. "It's over," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's over, baby. You're safe." She clung to him. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." "Shh," he soothed, holding her tighter. "You were the only one who did when it mattered. You were the bravest person in that courtroom." The following days were a whirlwind. The news cycles did a complete 180. Killer Cop was replaced with Wrongly Convicted Hero. The DA, looking both embarrassed and resolute, stood at a press conference and formally dropped all charges against Ben Carter. His record was wiped clean. His badge was returned to him in a quiet, private ceremony. But the badge felt heavy in his hand. It represented a system that had failed him, that had been so eager to believe the simplest, ugliest story. He held it for a long moment, then placed it gently in a drawer. He wasn't that man anymore. The cop in him had died the night he found Sarah. The man who walked away was just a father. A few weeks later, on a crisp, sunny morning, Ben and Chloe stood before Sarah's grave. It was the first time they had come together. The headstone was simple, just her name and the dates of a life ended far too soon. Ben placed a single white rose on the grass. "We got him, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Chloe, she got him for you. She was so brave." Chloe slipped her hand into his. "We miss you, Mom." It wasn't a happy ending. How could it be? Sarah was still gone. The years they lost were still stolen. But the poison of the lie was gone. They could finally mourn her properly, their grief no longer twisted by betrayal and doubt. They stood there for a long time, in the quiet peace of the cemetery, feeling the sun on their faces, beginning the long, slow process of healing together. Later that day, back in their new, small apartment, the doorbell rang. It was a courier with a small, flat package. No return address. Ben opened it cautiously. Inside, there was no note. Just a single, glossy photograph. It was a candid shot of a man in an expensive suit getting into a chauffeured car downtown. He was a city official, a man Ben knew by sight, a man who had been quietly linked to the drug syndicate Thorne worked for, but never charged. And scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in black marker, was a single, chilling question. The bigger fish. You coming for him, too? Ben stared at the photo, his blood running cold. He looked over at Chloe, who was watching him, her expression a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Thorne was right. They had caught the weapon. But the hand that aimed it was still out there, smiling for the cameras, thinking he was untouchable. The fight for justice was over. But a new fight, a quieter, more dangerous one, had just been delivered to their doorstep. There's a silence that comes after a great noise. It's not the same as the silence that came before. The silence before was empty, waiting to be filled. The silence after is full. It's heavy with everything that has happened. For Ben and Chloe, their new apartment was filled with that kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, painful quiet of their old house on Hemlock Street. This was different. It was the quiet of two people who had screamed all their screams and cried all their tears, and were now, finally, just resting. Ben made pancakes on a Saturday morning. He burned the first batch. Chloe laughed, a real, genuine laugh that sounded like music in the small kitchen. A few months ago, that sound would have been followed by a pang of guilt. Now, it was just a laugh. It was okay to be happy again. Sarah would have wanted that. He'd gotten his PI license. His first client was a woman whose brother was in prison for a crime she swore he didn't commit. Ben knew that story. He took the case. Chloe enrolled in college, majoring in forensic psychology. She wanted to understand the minds of the people who twisted the truth. She wanted to make sure what happened to her family didn't happen to anyone else. One evening, they were hanging a painting in the living room. It was one of Sarah's earlier works, a vibrant, abstract splash of color they'd kept in storage. As Ben held it against the wall, Chloe tilted her head. "A little to the left," she said. He shifted it. "No, wait. Back to the right. Just a little." He smiled. It was such a normal, silly moment. A father and a daughter hanging a picture. But for them, it was a miracle. They were building a new life, piece by piece, around the memory of the one they'd lost. The shadow of the man with the scar was gone, but the light of the woman who loved to paint remained. Later, Ben stood at his window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the badge in his drawer. He didn't miss it. He had a different purpose now. He thought about the photograph of the city official, still tucked away in a locked box. That was a problem for another day. For now, the fight was over. The war for their souls was won. The silence in the apartment was peaceful. It was the sound of healing. It was the sound of a father and daughter finding their way back to each other, one quiet moment at a time. Time has a way of sanding down the sharpest edges of our pain. For Ben and Chloe, the frantic, terrifying chapters of their story were finally closed. They had built a new life, not on the ruins of the old one, but next to it. A life of quiet mornings, of burned pancakes, and of a peace that felt earned, not given. Ben's new PI business was small, but it mattered. He specialized in the cases others thought were hopeless, the ones where the system had already made up its mind. He became a whisper of hope for people who had lost their voice. Chloe was thriving in her classes, her mind sharp and hungry for justice, her heart no longer burdened by the weight of a lie. They were a team. He had the instincts of a veteran cop. She had the fresh, determined eyes of a new generation. Together, they were healing, using their pain to mend the broken pieces in the world around them. One afternoon, A thick manila envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Just Ben's name and address typed on a plain white label. Chloe watched as he picked it up from the mat. She saw the slight hesitation in his hand, the tiny flicker of old fear in his eyes. He carried it to the kitchen table and slid a knife under the flap. Inside, there were no threatening letters. No more creepy photographs. Instead, it was a stack of documents. Financial records, bank statements from an offshore account, and coded emails that were painstakingly deciphered. It was a dossier. A road map. All pointing to the man in the suit from the first photo, the city official. And paperclipped to the front page was a new, typewritten note. It was only one line long. The water is warm. Are you ready to swim? Ben slid the folder toward Chloe. She scanned the first few pages, her eyes widening. This wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. Someone on the inside, someone who knew the truth, was handing them the keys to the kingdom. Ben looked at his daughter, at the fierce, determined woman she had become. We have a good life now, Chloe. A quiet one. We could just let it be. Chloe met his gaze, her expression steady. She thought of her mother's sketchbook, of the humming, of the stand she took in a crowded courtroom. We could, she said softly. Then she tapped the dossier with her finger. But can we? Ben looked at the folder, then back at his daughter. A slow, determined smile touched his lips. It was the same question, echoing in the quiet of their kitchen. An unanswered question that was no longer scary, but a challenge. A challenge they were now ready to face. Together. This story proves that even in our darkest moments, courage can rewrite our future. If Chloe's stand in that courtroom left you breathless, subscribe for more. Because next week's story is about a woman who found a single sentence scribbled in a library book, a sentence that led her to a secret the government buried 50 years ago.